I've been showing many of my own photos, so now it's time for you to show yours. And I received a couple of contributions from you guys that I'm going to analyze and give some feedback on. Stick around if you want to have your photo reviewed, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell notification so you don't miss out. With that said, let's begin. This is a photo from a YouTuber called Findominator. He took this photo on his vacation to a place called Louie, L-O-O-E, in England. The photo is shot with a Samsung Galaxy S5. His thoughts when he took the photo was pretty casual, like he wanted to take some photos and he did, and then he realized that he thought his photo could look good as a postcard picture. I like that approach of taking a photo just because, why not? But it does have its advantages and disadvantages. What I'm seeing is a big cliff with a couple of apartment houses on top of it. Then there's also a big medieval looking gate in the cliff. There is turquoise water in the middle of the photo and a hint of what seems like a dock in the foreground. In the background I see a cloudy sky. To shoot a photo with a smartphone and correct exposure when there's such a big contrast like there is in this environment, it's kind of hard. The houses, water and dock do have a good exposure, but the cliff and sky is having a bit too much contrast. It's not beyond saving though, which is good. When you have a bright sky and some shadows like this, you need to choose your motive. Once you know your main motive, you know what to expose correctly. Like if I wanted the cliff to be the main motive, I would let the sky get overexposed and have the cliff correctly exposed. This depends on what kind of technique you use. HDR or a camera with high dynamic range could have exposed both the highlights and shadows correctly. But if you don't have any other option, or you want your highlights or shadows to be overexposed or underexposed, then I would definitely choose the main motive to be correctly exposed. But as I mentioned, this photo is not badly exposed, just a little in the shadows and highlights. Even though the shadows are a bit too dark, you can lift them enough to see what's going on underneath. When I did some editing, I could see much more detail and color in the shadows, and some slight detail in the sky, which is perfect to me, because the sky is not as important as the cliff in my opinion. So with some editing, this photo becomes much better. Then there's composition. My initial thought was that I want to see more, or at least come closer to the cliff and houses. I like the angle it was taken from, which adds some depth into the photo with these lines. But I think he could have gotten rid of the foreground or include more of it, because right now I feel like it doesn't really serve a purpose. So I would have tried out some different angles to make the cliff and houses pop out more. My overall feeling is that it is a cool photo with some epic vibes, but could have been a little more thought through. And I really recommend you to download some editing apps, because you can do a lot with some basic editing. Next up is Eric from Sweden's photo. This one have more of a backstory to it. He said he wanted to give the feeling of depth using the logs to the right and the feeling of a boat floating in the air in a dramatic way, and therefore decreased the blue luminance in the sky and increased the contrast in the water. The camera used was a Nikon D5600 on a tripod, and the lens were a kit lens of 18 to 55mm set at 26mm. With an aperture set at f11 and a shutter speed of 1/125th of a second. And lastly, the ISO set at 100. So let's talk about what I see in this photo. There are some logs on top of each other, a wooden boat, and a cloudy sky that reflects into the water. In the background there are some more modern types of boats, and even further away there are some mountains. The focus of the photo is crisp and clean, from the logs all the way back to the mountains. Eric used a small aperture which contributed to a longer focus depth, and the tripod and low ISO kept it extra sharp. The quick shutter speed froze the motion too, so there's no motion blur. I don't think a longer shutter speed would have hurt though, since it could give the clouds and water a more smooth but still dramatic edge to it. The exposure looks okay. I mean, it's a bit contrasty, but that's made in editing, so there's a meaning behind it. And since it's taken midday, it's extra hard to get that exposure right where you want it. Personally, I think I would have taken the photo at another time of the day because the light is very hard in broad daylight. Let's talk about the editing. As I said, Eric decreased the blue luminance in the sky and increased the contrast of the water. Then there might be some sort of clarity added into the whole of the picture. I like most part of the editing, but there's something about the contrast that is a bit off. Though I think I have the answer if we move on to composition. I'm really excited about this photo because it's interesting to talk about. There are many things in this photo which is attractive, but I don't think the boats in the background are interesting. So I would have gone lower and closer to the water with the camera, so the boats would disappear behind the wooden boat and the jetty. A lower angle would kind of lift the boat to become even more powerful. Now, I really like the idea of the logs adding depth, which they do. But they're also leading lines that leads us towards the jetty and boats in the background. I think they should lead towards the wooden boat. It is this middle part which doesn't fit in my opinion, and I think that is what bothers me when it comes to the contrast editing. You see, the logs are leading right into the jetty that is underexposed, so it's like the photo wants me to see the jetty, but when I get there, I don't see much in these shadows. If the background boats were removed, maybe the jetty could be a sort of connector between the boats and the logs. Except for that, the contrast is serving its purpose in the overall photo. Then there are some other alternatives that I will show you. Those would mean that the logs and middle part wouldn't be included at all, like cropping it like this, or this. The boat could do the job itself of adding depth since you already have depth in the contrast and leading lines of the wooden planks. And in this composition I like the editing because the shadows looks good here, you still can see the structure in the shadows. But I can see that you've put in some thought behind the composition and that mindset will reward you in the end. You have a lot of potential and I would love to see more photos of yours in the future. Then lastly we have another YouTuber called Jaidenrulez 10 and his photo. This is a pretty straightforward photo of a cat. The camera used was a Samsung J7 Sky Pro. He got this photo of his cat after a while since the cat was a bit scared of the camera. So the focus is slightly off, not that much, but enough for me to notice. Then I would increase the exposure of the cat itself. I would actually prefer to have the window completely overexposed in order to see the cat better. I did some editing myself just to show what can be done. As you see, I overexposed the highlights since what's happening outside isn't really relevant. It was hard to get enough detail in the shadows though, and that's what happens when it's underexposed. So once again, decide what your main object or motive is and then be sure to expose it correctly. The composition is okay. The angle it was taken from adds some depth with these lines. Though I would have cropped the sides of the window. This way it looks more clean. Personally, I would have gotten closer to the cat too. Maybe you could have been more patient and earned the cat's trust a bit more so it wouldn't be so scared. Overall, I think you're on the right track with the composition, and I recommend to learn about exposure and shutter speed in order to get the more technical parts right. Now, if you're interested in getting your photos analyzed, then stick around and I will tell you how to do it. But before that, I will say thank you to the contributors. Hope this feedback have helped and keep on taking more photos. And if you're interested in seeing the contributors' YouTube channels, I will link them in the description below. So, if you want your photo to be reviewed, then send them to this mail. I will also link it in the description below. Don't forget to give me a little bit of information about the photo, like what camera was used, what your thoughts were when you took the photo. It can be something like, I took this photo with my Nikon D3300 and I wanted to express the feeling of summer tranquility. Or maybe I took this with my iPhone 7 and my thoughts were that the scenery looked so awesome that I just took a photo of it. Be sure to subscribe and turn on the bell notification so you don't miss out. Have a great time!